everybody can see that. I want to give you a little update where we're at this year. Due to all the problems with the COVID, we did have to cut back a little bit on what we're doing to get things approved. We had to go through an approval process to how we're going to do things. The main thing that affected my program is we had to cut back on OVT locations. So we only have 3 OVT locations this year, but we were able to get approved. I think most all the Cotton Producers Association, Cotton Incorporated research, and that includes a lot of seed quality research that Guy and I are doing with a graduate student that's looking, this looks pretty good this year. So that's where we're at. We're able to go out and look at cotton and visit fields and things like that. We're just a little restricted in the lab, and early on we were restricted on exactly how much research we could do. So we're glad to be here with you today. I remember back when I first went to a defoliation meeting in the mid 80s, and heard some people that had a lot of experience in defoliation, and they called it science and an art. And I think that's still true today, even though we have a few tools now that we used to did not have. Defoliation boils down to 3 questions: when you're going to do it, what you're going to do it, and what rates. And I'm going to talk about when. Certainly all 3 of those things are important considerations. So planning your defoliation, certainly you need to think about variety selection. I'm going to talk a little bit about micronear and storm proofness, the field location, and your harvest schedule. You certainly don't want to get too far away ahead of your harvest schedule. Guy's going to talk about maybe how that relates to using regrowth control. And it's too late now to think about methquat, but certainly that goes into the equation when you're thinking ahead about when you're going to defoliate and harvest. So what we want to happen when we defoliate is to cause the leaves to upsize. And the way that happens is that we either provide, what we want to do is we want to increase ethylene and decrease oxen. So we want to change that ratio. And when we increase the ethylene to oxen ratio, that signals these abscission zones to form. You see this abscission zones there. Certainly, thankfully, when a boll is old, that abscission zone is not active anymore when it's developed. So our defoliants don't affect that abscission zone, but they affect that abscission zone you see at the base of the leaf. And one of the important things, there's 2 ways to affect that hormone relationship between, or ratio between, auxins and ethylene. One is to injure the leaf. That injury causes ethylene production and increases the ethylene to auxin ratios and can cause abscission. The other way is to apply ethylene, and that's what prep and finish and things like that do. So so you can do that hormonally with things like prep, or drop, or you can do it herbicidally, is how we call it, and that's just injuring the leaves. The key there is you want to injure the leaf with these herbicidal type defoliants the guy's going to talk about. You want to injure them enough that it produces enough ethylene to send those signals, but you don't want to kill them so quickly that process doesn't have time to happen. When you do, that's when you end up with those stuck, crinkly leaves that can get a lot of trash in your cotton. So there's also abscission zones along the sutures of the boll wall too. So that's primarily how prep and finish and boll openers work. Or even if you had to resort to paraquat, you're causing injury and increasing ethylene, and also helping dry the plant or the boll. So there are several different tools that people have come up with for predicting when to defoliate, percent opens, probably the one that most people are familiar with. There's one that is used a lot in the Mid-South, DD60, the number of DD60s past peak bloom or at cutout. Then there's nodes above crack bowl and also just cutting bowls. That's the old-timey way. It's probably the best way. So percent open, this is some old data. One of the first slides I ever got, and I got this from Steve Crawford in Louisiana, and he was one of the early people working on defoliation. And if you look at most labels, most of the labels talk about percent open, and they were based on, this is some of the research those labels were based on, is percent open. And you can see there by 64% open, he found that he pretty close to maximized yields. So that's what a lot of our early defoliant labels were based on. I'm going to talk, certainly percent open is a valid thing to look at, but I'm going to talk about a couple others that I think are more valid. First, though, DD60 past peak bloom. Although we hear about that a lot if you're reading some of the cotton magazines and stuff coming out of the Mid-South, it really doesn't work well for us. One of the things is the DD60 system is designed more, we get penalized for the cooler nights we have in the fall, and we would rarely get 850 DD60s after peak bloom, which is what they're counting on in the Mid-South. The other thing is this works pretty good in Arkansas, where you have a irrigated system and you have a consistent fruit load. You don't get gaps like somebody mentioned it earlier, fruiting gaps. I think it was Tim Britton or somebody. That's very common for us. So even defining peak bloom is really hard for us. We don't have the same flowering curves that they do in the Mid-South. It can go up and down for us because of stresses during the season. So the other thing is we have pretty small fields, and keeping track of DD60s on all these fields would really be difficult and probably not worth it. So the way I like the best when it works is nodes above crack bowl. And it's based on this relationship. Probably most of you have seen this relationship about how a cotton plant fruits over time. And here, if you see this one fruited on day 0, say that's July 1st, then 3 days later, this one fruits. 3 days later here, 3 days later here, you've got a aborted fruit, and 3 days later here. And what we know is when this bowl, what we've seen is when this bowl just cracks open, that a bowl about 12 days younger. Hold on just a second. Can you get this dog? So that a bowl that's 12 days younger than that cracked open bowl is mature. That's what this is based on, okay? And that's generally true. It's not always true. But that's what nodes above cracked bowl are based on. So sometimes we have a compact crop like this, where we haven't had a lot of stress, we haven't had a lot of insect damage, plant bugs, things like that. And in this situation, nodes above cracked bowl, if this one just cracked open and you're looking at a first position bowl, you count 1, 2, 3, 4. That would be 5 if this is a harvestable bowl. So you have to determine what you think is harvestable. Now, in my mind, if a bowl is not pretty much fully sized by the end of September, I'm not going to consider it harvestable. So, and a bowl full size still has several weeks of development left. Okay. when it's first reached full size. So in this case, this cotton is almost ready to defoliate. If that boll is not harvestable, uh, then, and this one is, then 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sure you count the blank fruiting branches. This one would be nodes above crack boll of 4, and that crop would be ready. In any situation, though, this is a better candidate for defoliation than this one, which is 60% open. Because if we look here, this one just cracked open, so 3, 6, 9, 12, up to right here. That if there was a boll there, it would probably be mature, but the ones above it are not mature. So this crop is not mature, would not be mature, and that's what we're going to face a lot this year with some of this crop that went to the dry weather and now is set a top crop. So one of the ways I look at this is almost like a guy had a family, and he got divorced, and he married a young wife, and he had another family, and there's a big age discrepancy here. Okay, so we really need, when we get this situation right here, we need to wait till we either get a crack boll up here or start cutting these youngest bolls at the top, and look to make sure they're mature. So here's some other situations. Here's one that's 60% open and 4 nodes above crack boll. You know, that happens. It tends to happen that those two guidelines coincide when you have really good cotton with a lot of fruiting branches. For us, that might be 11, 12 fruiting branches, and you don't have a lot of fruiting gaps due to stress or insects. Here, have another one here where you've got 60% open bolls. It's not quite as severe as the first one I showed you, but if you notice here, this boll is completely open. We don't even know where that crack boll is. It's somewhere in here. So we either have to wait till this boll cracks, or you need to go out here and cut these bolls to determine if they're mature on a crop like this. We're probably going to see something. If you're closely watching your cotton this year, you're probably going to see that nodes above crack boll just sort of disappear. And you know, if you wait till that oldest unopened boll cracks, you're probably costing yourself a little bit of time. So you know, it's always a question whether to go for a top crop or not. Like I said earlier, you know, if the boll's not pretty much fully developed and you can see the seed fairly well, and when you cut a boll by the end of September, you know, the chances of that boll developing are pretty slim. So we normally talk about a boll developing in 45, 50 days. That's with good weather and a good active plant. You know, a boll can take 70 days or more to develop in cooler weather or in a plant that's not as active. So when I look at that field right there, I'm seeing that reddening happening, and those leaves are not photosynthesizing much at all. We're not going to get a lot more boll development. The redder those leaves are, and the more red leaves you have, the less boll development you're going to have. Now you see some plants here in the foreground and some in the background. They're pretty green, so they're still photosynthetically active. So that might help you in deciding whether you're going to go for a top crop. You can see here that this top crop is, you know, pretty mature, but you've got some bolls in here that are probably not mature, whether they're worth waiting on. So this is some work we did with one of a graduate student several years ago, and this shows if you don't have a fruiting gap, the percent open doesn't matter as much. In this particular field that year, it didn't matter much at all. But if you had a fruiting gap, and what we did is we removed the fruit from nodes 9 through 12, that defoliation time increased it. I mean, yields increased as you delayed defoliation. And in this, here's another year, and every year looked different. But almost always there was more penalty to pay. If you had a fruiting gap, the solid line here, the more paid to wait till later in the open bowl process. If you don't have a fruiting gap, the less likely waiting is going to help you. So here's a study. We've done a lot of defoliation time studies over the year, and this is the one I like to use because it illustrates two different points. You can see the nodes above crack bowl there: 6, 4.6, 2.8, 1.5, 0.7, 0.4, and those corresponded to those percent opens ranging from 18 to 95. And our yields, if we'd have defoliated on September the 9th at 18% open, we definitely hurt our yields, okay? Probably at that point, all the bowls were full size, but they didn't have all their secondary wall development and thickness of the fiber and micro. You can see that in the micronear being very low. Now, on September 16th, our yields are maximized. We never significantly increased yields with a later defoliation. It was only 4.6 nodes above crack bowl. It was only 34% open. And one of the things you can look at here is the mic is lower than if you'd waited to 60% open. Now here we didn't get into a discount range, but you can imagine the situation if it had been a little more dry, a little drier, or maybe used a variety that tended towards high mic, where proper timing of defoliation might reduce the number of bales that you have that go high mic. We don't want to manage micronear too much with defoliation timing because we can reduce yields, but being timely, especially with those varieties that tend to be high mic, can help us with micronear. Now, if we look back at this, if we'd have defoliated here on September 16th versus waiting till it was 60% open on September 28th, we gained 12 years. If that's our first field, and that's the one that determines when the pickers get in the field, we've gained 12 days in September. And this is from Mississippi, but it's would be relevant to anywhere in the Southeast. Is the later in the season we go, the less days of the week you are suitable for harvest, and the less hours per day are suitable for harvest, and the less acres you're going to probably cover with time. So gaining 12 days in September might save you a month of November days or October days. So it can be very valuable. Here's another example of a defoliation timing test where we had two different varieties. One is a high mic variety, and one was a variety that does not have high mic, or rarely has high mic. And you can see with that Stonewall 474, that's an old variety, but it is a high mic variety. If we left it out there past 60% open, and sometimes we have cotton, I'll say sometimes, very often we have cotton that goes way past 60% open when we defoliate it. You've allowed that mic to creep up on you. So what's happening here, you don't see much difference in yield here, except for that really early defoliation. So what's happening is during this period from 45% open to 81% open, we're probably gaining a little yield, but we're losing a little yield, and it's roughly just, a net, no gain, no loss. We're losing about as much as we're gaining with weathering and stringing out and things like that. So, but we are increasing that micronear. So, and this one, the 5409 variety that has lower micronear, defoliating too early would hurt yields, but it also got micronear and penalty on the early end, but the late end. So what that says is, you can't defoliate all your cotton at one time and get too far ahead of your picker and your ability to control regrowth. So if you're going to delay defoliation, the fields you need to delay defoliation, make sure they're fields, number one, that are storm proof. So we have a lot of data on that, a storm proof variety may lose 1/5 of the amount of cotton that a non-storm proof variety would lose. So make sure that the varieties, if you plan this system out, that you got some varieties that are storm proof that you can not worry about defoliating too early, and make sure they're also varieties that don't tend to go high mite. So that just shows more of the same. So, and then the last one's cutting bowls. And especially this year, that nudge above crack bowl is going to disappear for a little while. And that fruiting gap, we got some skippy stands with some of the weather we had. So you got some fruit on vegetative branches that might constitute a fair amount of your yield. They're going to be less mature, so make sure you're cutting some of those top bowls. And if you've got a lot of fruit on vegetative branches, that you're cutting some of the bowls on the vegetative branches. And what we'd like to see is, you see over here that seed is solid. It's not jelly-like like it is way over on the right. And I can see that seed coat turning brown. Okay, so that's what somewhere right in here is what you want your least mature bowls to be. You don't have to wait till every one of them are slap black seed coats. And but that's where you want your least mature. And then the majority of your bowls are going to be over in here. And there's a good example there. So, Guy, that's what I have. I don't know if you want to do questions now or wait till we finish up.
We can go ahead and take a couple questions now. So anybody have questions for Dr. Edmiston? I'll allow folks to unmute themselves for the time being if they have a few questions. Or you can ask something in the chat. All right, Dr. Edmiston, I've got one. Given the year we've had, and there's going to be a lot of people chasing the top crop, and we sent out that newsletter a few weeks back encouraging folks to flag some of the upper nodes that were blooming right around our last effective bloom date. So for folks that didn't do that, I can foresee a scenario where they're going to wait and wait and wait, trying to make some of these top bowls that probably look better than the bottom crop. At what point would you throw in the towel? In other words, at what point does it really not pay to wait any longer?
Usually that is around the middle of October for us. So I think it's very important in the first, second week of October to be watching the weather. And if you see something coming that looks like it's going to terminate your crop, in other words, get some frost, usually our frost don't occur quite that early, but we seldom have the kind of weather or leaf condition to continue to gain much yield. So, if you wait past the middle of October, you may have given up a chance for the materials that guys are going to talk about to work very well, your bowl openers to work very well. And Guy, you may want to add to that.
No, that's you hit the nail on the head. I encourage folks to watch the weather and watch the temperatures, and you certainly don't want to end up in a scenario where you're just waiting and waiting, and then we get a tropical event coming here either, and you end up losing the large majority of the bottom crop. And you're probably not going to make some of that top crop. So
that's right. So we got a couple questions in the chat.
Okay.
Why am I seeing hardlock in the bottom? Guy, we were talking. Are you going to talk about that a little bit?
I can, but you take it away if you want to.
Well, we had a lot of wet weather, so that's usually when we see hardlock is when the bowls crack open and there's a lot of moisture, and they just that's. I think while we're seeing it, Guy, you got anything to add to that?
Same thing, high moisture in September, sometimes in late August. I mean,
And then
that's what drives
define
that
cutout.
bowl out too.
So, yeah,
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
So define cutout. So, Tim, that's an interesting question because normally people define cutout is when you get to 4 nodes above white bloom. And nodes above white bloom, you don't count like nodes above cracked bowl. It's from the first position white bloom to the top of the plant. Nodes above cracked bowl, you count from that first position cracked bowl to the highest harvestable bowl. So I've seen people get that mixed up. So I want to make sure that's clear. But when that nodes above white bloom gets to 4, if you look at most of the research, that means that 98% of the cotton that you're going to make is on the plant. You know, it's there. The problem is we can see that too in a year where we have good moisture and or we in an irrigated situation. The problem with us is that we may go into first bloom sometimes with the nodes above white bloom of 4 or something. And a lot of times what can happen for us is that cutout is not due to boll load, it's due to temperatures, and it's not a true cutout. So cutout to me is when you have enough boll load to stop that plant. And in general, you see that if you have a good boll load and your nodes above white bloom is at about 4. Sometimes we will have what I call a suspended cutout where we're gaining. So in a real cutout, you're not gaining any extra nodes, or if you are, they're very, very slow. Well, a lot of times what we'll be at is a nodes above, you get dry, you got a nodes above white bloom of 4 or 5, and you know, the textbook would define that as cutout, but there's not enough boll load there to slow the plant down. So if we get some rain, we keep adding some nodes and we keep flowering and we just stay there for several weeks somewhere floating around 4 or 5. So that's not a true cutout. So that's a good point. Is that Craig, Richard, Ellison? Yeah. Okay, so are you just trying to hide yourself, Craig, that you're a Clemson fan, calling yourself Richard? So that's great. At Frost Advisory, I don't know, maybe you can share with us a little bit more about how that happens.
You're muted, Craig.
Yeah, the peanut agents, we get access to the Frost Advisory, and we know what we get this information from up around Wakefield, and it just kind of helps cue us in on what the probability of getting a frost is up here it's very important up here on the Virginia line, and we access that and share it with our peanut growers. And I couldn't remember if we did it as cotton agents or not, and but I'd be glad to share that link with Guy if he wants to do something like that too.
Yeah, you can always type that link in the chat too. Yep. So David, that's exactly why your statement there. I was at cutout on July 10th. Now I'm not. I put on 8 nodes since hurricane. That's exactly why I don't recommend using the DD60 past peak bloom, because it's really hard to define peak bloom in a lot of cases for us because of things like what you just said. And it's another reason why some of these computer programs that have been developed like Cotman and Gossam Comax and things like that just have not worked very well, is because they're based on everything being irrigated and going right, sunshine and sunny days, and for us it's just not like that. Our cotton can develop in various ways, and it's a lot harder to define.
That was a very common scenario this year, yeah. Especially in David's part of the world. It started blooming and almost went immediately into cutout by the definition of cutout. And then when August rains returned, yeah, it just kind of stayed in that suspended cutout for a while. And we are where we are now. So All right, any more questions for Dr. Evanston? Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Evanston. Some very good comments there. All right, I'm going to try to share my screen now. Let's see what we can do here. All right. You see my screen okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk more about product selection and a few other things that are pertinent to defoliation decisions. And, you know, there's a lot of products out there on the market, and defoliation decisions in terms of product selection can oftentimes be very confusing. And so I've found it's oftentimes just best to break things down in its simplest form and think about what each product does and what its fundamental purpose is, and begin to piece together a tank mix from there. So when we defoliate cotton, we're trying to achieve three primary goals. Sometimes it's only two of the three, but in many cases for us, it's going to be three primary goals. Those are leaf removal, regrowth, removal and prevention, and boll opening. All right, so with leaf removal, we want to remove not only the mature leaves, which are going to be most of the leaves on the plant, but any juvenile growth that's on the plant at that time. So regrowth and juvenile growth are essentially the same tissue. That's just new vegetative tissue that's coming on the plant. But it's a different terminology for the same tissue on the plant. Juvenile growth is, we refer to that as growth that's on the plant the day you defoliate. Regrowth is that tissue that occurs after you defoliate. Regrowth is very common for us, especially in the first half to maybe 2/3 of the defoliation season, depending on the year. A lot of that's driven by rainfall and or temperatures. And lastly, boll opening. We're typically going to face cooler weather at some point in our defoliation window. But regardless of the case, we want to open the bolls as rapidly as we possibly can. And it's rare that we want to wait on a frost to do that for us. So most of the time, it's going to be all three of these goals that we want to achieve. Sometimes it's just two of the three. So from here, we'll kind of break it down into what each product does, and hopefully that'll help you begin to piece together a tank mix. And we'll talk about some tank mixes that are fairly broad spectrum in terms of their efficacy and their performance across a broad range of different conditions. So we get questions all the time on, you know, sometime in early September, what's your preferred tank mix? Well, that depends on a lot of different things, and especially rates. You know, I can talk about a tank mix with certain products, but they'll tell me, what rate would you use of each? Well, I have no idea until you get to the day of defoliation. And a lot of factors go into not only product selection, but what rate we use. The big one there is temperature and humidity. The status of the crop plays a role in it, fertility levels, and we'll see that play a role this year. We're going to have several fields with a lot of residual nitrogen left over just because of the hot, dry weather that occurred in July. I always like to consider the weather leading up to the day of defoliation and what the weather forecast is from that day forward. That plays a big role in rates and product selection too. And whether or not a product is going to be used as a standalone or with one other tank mix partner or with two or three other tank mix partners, that influences the rates that we use. And regardless, we encourage you to observe all the label requirements for all of these products. So you heard Dr. Evanston mention hormonal products and herbicidal products. And we're going to start with the ones that target regrowth, and whether or not that's to remove juvenile growth or prevent regrowth from occurring. The first ones here are hormonal. Genstar does have a herbicidal component to it, and there are products here that we're going to talk about that can achieve 2 of the 3 goals that we talked about to start with. So the first ones here are free fall, drop. There's several other different trade names out there. A lot of times we refer to that as just thidiazeron or TDZ. There's several different generics, but drop and free fall are the common names for these. I'm going to talk about the label rates and then the ones that we kind of prefer in tank mixes. So on the label, you can go from 1.6 to 3.2. If it's a standalone, you can go up to 6.4. Rarely do we use drop or free fall as a standalone here in North Carolina. In many, many cases, though, we use that 3.2 ounce rate. For whatever reason, historically, many growers tend to cut rates of free fall in hopes of adding higher rates of something else. But looking at trial data, especially in years where we have a lot of regrowth or expect a lot of regrowth, at 3.2 ounce rate, that gives you 1/10 of a pound active per acre. That is very effective at defoliating and preventing and removing regrowth. It is a hormonal product, so it's going to be temperature sensitive. The warmer it is, the better it's going to perform. When we get below 65 and especially below 60 degrees, we see its performance start to fall off. So when we get into a trend where your nighttime temperatures, for example, are consistently noticeably below 60 degrees, the activity of this product could fall off or be slower. And at that point, we look more towards the Genstar type products. There's several trade names there. Adios, Cutout, there's several more. This contains the same active ingredient that's in the drop and free fall, just at a different concentration. So your free fall and drops, those are 4 pound active per gallon materials. Your Genstars and Adioses and products like that, that's 1 pound per gallon active, plus a 1/2 pound of diuron per gallon. All right. These products are effective at removing regrowth and preventing regrowth, but they're also good defoliants and just foliage removers. So they're fairly effective at just a standalone defoliant. They don't do much for bowl opening though. All right. So on the label for these, you can go anywhere from 6.4 up to 16 ounces. We don't go that high in North Carolina. Most of the time here, depending on your tank mix partners, we're going to be somewhere between 6 to 10 ounces. All right, so talking a little bit about regrowth, I expect to see quite a bit of this year, especially in the terminal. Now, every year is different, but regrowth is not uncommon for us. If we have a warm September with any kind of moisture, regrowth is to be expected. Now, it's cooler this year. What we do have is a plant that has cycled back around from where we had a dry July. And let's see, we have a couple in the chat. All right, we'll answer those shortly. So we have a crop that we have where we had a dry July. It cycled back around, started growing again in August. And we're unclear right now on which bowls will make it unless you went out and flagged some of those blooms on the upper nodes back when our last effective bloom date occurred, which was towards the end of August. All right, so we could have a lot of this terminal regrowth, if you will, or renewed growth. So that would not be surprising to me this year. A lot of times when we have just a dry spell where we have a short crop for whatever reason, when the plant meets its bowl demands and fulfills those demands, as long as it's warm and we have moisture, the plant thinks it's in its natural environment. So it just cycles back around and generates new vegetative growth. And that's all regrowth really is. It's just renewed vegetative growth. So we can have that really in any given year, especially in the early part of our defoliation window. It tends to slow down once it gets cooler, but many times for us, we have regrowth that's already occurred or juvenile growth that's already occurred to deal with once it does get cooler. And that's when we look towards a GenStar type product. All right, so it could be just the crop conditions and the type of year, like what we just had with the dry July and then recent rains that cause regrowth. Residual nitrogen could certainly play a role in this. This is a scenario just for illustration purposes where we had a lot of residual nitrogen. And this is why we encourage growers to be very timely with their harvest. Now, we see this a lot of times too, and sometimes you just can't help it, where you defoliate and you get caught by rains or breakdowns or whatever. You just can't harvest on time. But sometimes we can help it. And we always encourage growers to don't defoliate any more than you can effectively harvest within the next 10 to 14 days. And this is one reason why, is regrowth. So if you have a lot of residual nitrogen, this is just an illustration here. You can see it 14 days after defoliation, we're about ready to harvest. But look at if we were to wait roughly 2 more weeks. All this regrowth that just occurred from a little bit of rainfall and a lot of residual nitrogen, essentially we had to go back and defoliate that crop all over again. All right, so that could happen in any given year. So it just drives home the point to only defoliate what you think you can effectively harvest in a timely manner. So this just illustrates some basal regrowth, lower on the plant, where you see these sympodial branches, reproductive branches coming into the main stalk. And that's where a lot of basal regrowth arises. And it's basically just a new vegetative branch. We just never see it really materialize into that. But it starts off small. So you got to keep in mind that this tissue is not a major demand for water. So it does not take much soil moisture to cause a problem. And it starts very small, so it's easy to underestimate. So when we defoliate a crop or a cotton crop, we're getting leaves off the plant. If we have moisture in the soil, now all of a sudden we're getting light down to these buds. So that's actually going to stimulate further regrowth if we don't include something in that defoliation tank mix to address regrowth or help prevent it or slow it down. So in just a short time, it can turn into something like this. And naturally, we don't want this ending up in the harvested lint like you see in that top right picture. All right, and that does not take much time at all. So any further delay past 10 to 14 days after you spray, you're going to see more and more of this. And even the best products we have only going to hold back regrowth, but for so long. Usually we see that break after 14 days. So sometime between 14 and 21 days, even the best products we have at our disposal can't hold it for that long, especially if you have a lot of soil moisture. All right, so back to rates. This is just a standard TDZ product like free fall or drop, looking at that 3.2 ounce rate. All right, so you're looking at a standard tank mix in the top left there without any TDZ. If you look closely, we're missing a lot of leaves, but we're essentially missing all the regrowth. And just to give you a little hint here, that was a marginal tank mix. It's not an optimal tank mix in terms of it's not the best products to use. All right, so, but if you look at the top right, that's what happens when you use the right rate of TDZ, something like drop or free fall, to address this regrowth. So my point here is, even some of these cheaper tank mixes with less than ideal products or less than ideal rates, we can make look pretty good as long as it's warm weather, especially when you have regrowth. We can make it look pretty good just by using the right rate of some of these TDZ type products. All right, so shifting gears again, we're back to describing some of these products. We're still on hormonal defoliants. Now we're looking at bowl opening and or defoliation. So first we have your Ethafon type products. Several trade names here. The old trade name Prep is the one most folks are familiar with. We have Ethafon 6, Super Bowl, all kinds of different trade names now. The ones I'm referring to here have 6 pounds active per gallon. So those will use that when you're considering rates. And the rates are fairly wide here. Most of the time we're going to use them between a pint and a third up to 2 2/3 pints per acre. That's the maximum labeled rate that we can use Ethafon in any form per acre in a given season. It's hormonal, so it's going to, you're going to get more activity when in warmer conditions. And the activity does reduce, especially when we get below 65 or 60 degrees on a consistent basis. So these products, they do aid in defoliation. Basically what they do is once they get inside the leaf, they break down to nothing more than ethylene gas that starts that cascade response and starting to weaken cell walls and help them form those abscission layers that Dr. Evanston was talking about. So they do aid in defoliation, but the primary purpose of these products are to stimulate bowl opening, which we want to occur very rapidly. So moving from there, though, we have products that are good defoliants and bowl openers, all right? First ones here are Cotton Quick or First Pick. They're two different trade names for the same thing. They contain Ethafon plus urea sulfate, which acts as a synergist. Very good defoliant. You don't see many of these products used anymore. They tend to be very corrosive. They can clog up tips and corrode pumps and things like that. One thing I will say is that they are very effective at not only defoliation, but opening bowls, especially when you get in a prolonged trend of cold weather where bowls just will not open for whatever reason, mainly due to cold weather. So these are used at fairly high rates, 1.5 to 2 quarts per acre, all right? And then finish, we have other ones too, like Terminate, and some generics like that. This is Ethafon, also a 6-pound material, similar to your Super Bowl and your Ethafon 6s and other products like that. It's a 6-pound material plus cyclanolin. This is a good defoliant and bowl opener too. Used to be a real premium product, still is, but used to be pretty expensive. So now we have some generics. It's quite a bit cheaper than it used to be. It's more active, especially in bowl opening, when we get into cooler weather. So when you see your nighttime or even daytime temperatures drop below 65 or 60 degrees on a consistent basis, we may want to consider switching from one of the Super Bowl type products to something like Finish, depending on what else you want the tank mix with it. Most of the time, we're going to be somewhere between a pint and a third to a quart per acre, depending on what else is in the tank with it, and also depending on temperatures. All right, so now we're switching to herbicidal defoliants. All right, Folex, it's a herbicidal defoliant. I kind of put it in a category by itself, though, because it behaves similarly to a hormonal type product, simply because we have an extremely wide range in rates that we can use that are dependent on temperature. All right. The primary purpose of this product is leaf removal, and it's very effective at removing foliage. It is very sensitive to temperatures, but we have a wide range of rates, and it's one of the most versatile products in terms of flexibility that can perform with a number of different tank mix partners. Most of the time, we can be 8 ounces. The label says you can go up to 1.5 pints. We're not going to really go that high in North Carolina. Most of the time for us, we're going to be at a tank mix rate of 8 to 16 ounces. 16 ounces is going to be more in cold weather, especially if it's a standalone and you're trying to just remove foliage, for example. Generally speaking, the large majority of the time, we're going to be somewhere between 8 and 12 ounces. There are some tank mix partners, though, that would cause us to go down to 4 and 6 ounces, which we'll discuss a little bit later. So then we have the other herbicidal defoliants, which are the PPO inhibitors. All right, very temperature sensitive. Be very careful when we have green tissue like juvenile growth, regrowth, what have you. Most of the time, you're going to need to use a crop oil of some sort with these. If it's really warm, you probably want to be at 0.5%. If it's cooler, you can bump that up to 1%. But we encourage you to just abide by the label requirements for additives on these. All right, the first one is AIM. Label, you can go up to 1.6 ounces. Generally, we're going to be somewhere between 3/4 of an ounce to an ounce. For best performance, you really need to have tank mix partners with something like Ethifon and or TDZ, like drop or free fall, something like that. And a lot of these herbicidal defoliants, like the PPO inhibitors here, are effective at killing some weeds like some morning glories or something like that. Generally going to be cheaper. If you have a small crop and it's an open sparse canopy and it's primarily going to be just older mature leaves that you're trying to get rid of, especially if temperatures are cooler, that's where these products have the best fit. The next one there is ET. On the label is 1.5 ounces to 2 3/4 ounces. For us, we're going to be usually between 1.5 ounces to 2 ounces, again with Ethifon and TDZ. Resource and Blizzard are used a little less commonly here. On the label for Resource is 4 to 6 ounces. Most of the time is for a tank mix rate. For us, it's going to be the 4 ounces, maybe 5 ounce rate with Ethifon and TDZ. Blizzard is 1/2 ounce to 0.6 of an ounce. Most of the time, we're going to be at that 1/2 ounce rate with Ethifon and TDZ. And then you have Sharpen and Display. We don't have much data here in North Carolina on either of these. For Sharpen, we're going to usually be between 1/2 ounce to an ounce with Ethifon and TDZ. And Display, that's actually a premix of AIM and Blizzard at different concentrations than just mixing those two products together. But that's used at 1 ounce per acre, like the others with Ethifon and TDZ. And based on the trial data that I've conducted back in Georgia with that particular product, both of these really, you can expect very similar results to the other PPO inhibitors. All right, so I generally show this in all my defoliation talks because this is a scenario where we intentionally desiccated all the leaves on the plant. And I always ask the question, do you think we did this with herbicidal defoliants or hormonal defoliants? And I get people to guess which ones they are. And it's somewhat of a trick question. We desiccated this with strictly hormonal defoliants. And the point I'm trying to make here is if you get your rates wrong or your product selection wrong, and it's too high for the temperatures, for example, you can expect something like this from really any tank mixture when it's improperly used. So it doesn't have to be one of the PPO inhibitors necessarily or something like that to stick leaves. I mean, you can do this with a number of products if you don't match your rates or your tank mix partners appropriately. All right, so just some brief comments on the additives. These are things like your crop oil, surfactants, AMS, methylated seed oils, etc. Generally speaking, if it's on the label for that product, in other words, it's the recommendations of the defoliant manufacturer, not necessarily the dealer, but the defoliant manufacturer, then we're generally going to support it. There are a lot of cases where you don't need an additive. The exceptions are going to be primarily the PPOs. They generally are going to need some sort of additive to improve their performance, but be very cautious with temperatures, especially when we get into the high 80s or 90s. So if you're not careful, there is a risk of desiccating some leaves, especially juvenile growth. But they do have a fit. If it's cooler weather, cloudy weather, or if you expect rain, especially within 24 hours, like in the case of drop or free fall or some of the other TDZ type products, those products have a lengthy rain-free period of 24 hours. So sometimes one of these additives can improve performance there. But generally speaking, if you expect rain in 24 hours, you're probably better off in just waiting for the rain to pass and wait for a nice sunny day, which we'll talk about timeliness in terms of weather just here shortly. All right, so other considerations, don't underestimate the power of using the right rate of drop or free fall. I mean, I really like the 3.2 ounce rate. We make a lot of tank mixes look good, especially early in the defoliation season. Once we get cooler, switch to a TDZ plus Diuron, something like Genstar or Adios, to address regrowth. There's no need to skimp on a TDZ type product at the expense of adding something else. So, make sure we're using the right rates for that. Application volume, I'm going to show you an illustration there. A lot of performance problems can be fixed with solely application volume. Ethafon, using the right rate of that, especially in cooler weather and especially when we have some bowls that are challenging to open, like what we expect to see this year. If you're using the right rates, that can bring a lot of value. We encourage growers to avoid defoliating more than they can harvest in a timely manner. But also, if you defoliate, make sure you capitalize on those time gains. So if you're using something like Finish that can accelerate ball opening, for example, and that enables you to harvest in 10 days versus 14, compared to a regular Ethafon type product like Prep or Super Bowl or something like that, then take advantage of it. All right, there's no need to wait. So that, the longer cotton sits out there, it can only get worse in terms of quality and yields too. We encourage growers to pay attention to the weather surrounding the day of defoliation. For whatever reason, the day you defoliate and a day or two after, if it's bright and sunny, hopefully warm, you can expect fairly good performance if you're using the right rates and application volume and good products and all that. If it's cloudy and cool for those first couple of days that you spray, for whatever reason, it seems to just set the bar and you just don't get very good efficacy, no matter what the weather turns out to be after that. So pay attention to that, because a lot of times we can prevent having to make a second trip just based on that fact alone. And pay attention to your prices. I encourage everybody to price these materials out, compare them. There are different tank mixes we can use and to achieve the same thing sometimes. So it depends on your needs and the needs of the crop. Just real quick, this illustrates what the right rate of Ethafon can do for you in terms of bowl opening. So again, that goes back to, you see an acceleration in bowl opening like this, take advantage of those time gains that you're getting. Go ahead and harvest the cotton and maximize those yields. There's no need to let it sit. All right, so this is probably the slide everybody wants to see. These are some tank mixes that, in my opinion, are very consistent across a broad range of environments. You still need to pay attention to temperatures, and you need to adjust the rates within each of these tank mixes accordingly. Not only pay attention to weather, but your crop conditions too. All right, so your first one is your standard three-way, Folex, Ethafon, Free Fall. So Folex, we're going to be 8 to 12 ounces, depending on temperatures. If we're in the very high 80s or even the low 90s, we're probably going to be at 8 to 10 ounces of Folex. Anything in mid to low 80s or less, we'll probably be at 12 ounces of Folex. Ethafon, depending on how many bowls you need to open and depending on temperatures. The cooler we are, the more we need to use. The less mature the bolls are, the more bowl opening activity we need, the higher the rate we need. And you can only go up to 2 2/3 pints there. Rarely we're going to be less than a pint or a pint and a third, though. That will only be in a case where you only have 1 or 2 bowls to pop open. And keep in mind that Ethafon does assist in defoliation. And then TDZ, I say 2.5 to 3.2 ounces. I really like that 3.2 ounce rate. All right, so occasionally I have seen folks use a PPO if temperatures are cooler and you have some morning glories or something like that out there. You throw in like 2 ounces of ET, for example, or maybe an ounce of vein or an ounce of distillate or something like that. If you're going to do that, you probably need to back off the Folex rate to somewhere between 4 and 8 ounces. Say you were going to use 12-ounce rate of Folex without the PPO, but you wanted to put the PPO in there, then you need to back off to at least 8 ounces or maybe down to 4, depending on the temperatures. The next one there is finish somewhere between a pint and a half to a quart, depending on temperatures and the degree of bowl opening that you need. With TDZ, drop or free fall at that 3.2 ounce rate if it's warm. If it's cooler, same finish rate with TDZ plus Diuron, which is a Genstar type product at 6 to 8 ounces, okay? Depending on the amount of regrowth and depending on temperatures. The cooler it is, the higher the rate on the Genstar type product. That's a premium tank mix, in my opinion. Used to be real expensive. It's not so much anymore. It's very competitive now. All right, the next one is finish somewhere between 1 pint and a pint and a third. You can spike that with Ethafon, something like Prep, with another pint, pint and a third. Keep in mind that regardless of the form it's in, you can only go to 2 2/3 pints of Ethafon per the label. Folex at some fairly low rates, 4 to 6 ounces, depending on temperatures, with drop, 2.5 to 3.2 ounces. That's a very effective tank mix that I see a lot of growers using. Can be a little pricey in some years. All right, and then the last one I've seen several times in trial settings, and it is a very good, consistent performer and is very price competitive. And that is a Genstar type product, somewhere between 8 and 10 ounces, depending on temperatures, with Ethafon, somewhere between a quart to 2 2/3 pints. Now, with the Genstar type product, if it's, I get a little wary of this tank mix if it's, in the 90s. If we're in the 80s or less, I like to be at that 8 ounce rate if it's noticeably cool. Low 80s to or less, down in the 70s, for example, we can bump that up to 10 ounces of a Genstar type product with however much Ethafon that you need. That would be a scenario when you need defoliation and a lot of regrowth prevention or removal, and some bowl opening activity. But that tank mix is a very consistent performer. I've seen it many times, and it's a good trade-off for cost too. So consider that one. All right, this is an illustration about application volume. This is a basal regrowth cleanup situation. So you can see some regrowth here. This is when I was using a defoliant at 10 gallons per acre. And you can see all I did was burn the edges of it. Didn't really do much at all. But when I bumped that up to 20 gallons an acre, I could essentially melt it out of the way. All right, so application volume alone is the difference there. So looking at overall defoliation, Dr. Emerson and myself have done some work here looking at this very thing at different nozzles. We're using a lot of these larger droplet nozzles like air induction or TTI tips now with the auxin herbicides, etc. And we got to be careful with that if we're defoliating. So if you look really close with one of these larger droplet nozzles down to 10 gallons an acre, we're missing a lot of leaves. 15 is somewhat acceptable. To do a really good job with the air induction tip, we need to be up at 20 gallons per acre. Flat fan, somewhat of the same thing. The more water we have, the better it's going to be. But really, if we go down to a hollow cone, which nobody does anymore, but if we use a hollow cone and we go the appropriate ground speed to use a hollow cone, that is the only nozzle that is effective at these very low application volumes, like 10 gallons an acre, okay? That can fog the entire canopy and get down to those lower leaves with those very, very fine droplets. Now, modern sprayers love to travel through the field at 20 miles an hour. That's not suitable for a hollow cone, and nobody's going to do that. So I'm not going to try to tell or sell you on hollow cone tips. What I will try to encourage you to do is pay attention to your application volume. So if you look here, for a small droplet nozzle, from 5 gallons up to 20 gallons an acre, you see some statistical noise here. But compare that to a larger droplet nozzle, which is very, very sensitive to application volume. So that's why we say no less than 15 gallons an acre, but 20 is usually going to be better than 15. So there's a big, big difference in the nozzle type in terms of performance at these low application volumes compared to these very high application volumes. So the higher application volume you have, that's going to be a little more forgiving in terms of nozzle selection. But we do encourage you, you probably don't want to use a larger droplet tip to defoliate cotton with, but make sure you pay attention to your application volume in your water, regardless of the tip. All right, preconditioning, we get a lot of questions on this. It's called preconditioning, sometimes 2-shot programs. If you have friends in the Mid-South, they do this religiously. Here, it may have a fit, but we don't do it to that extreme. The idea behind it is if you have a thick canopy crop, for example, you want to go in and remove a few leaves with one application using lower than normal rates, and then come back a second time and clean up and get the rest of it. So you can get more complete defoliation, or you can, some ideas are to reduce bowl rot and hard lock, which in my opinion are going to be driven by environmental conditions regardless of how we defoliate. And we see that a lot of times in cotton that's lodged over. So what I would encourage people to do if they're going to do this is make sure your upper bowls are mature. What you don't want to do is go out with a marginal program and you plan on doing a 2-shot program and you go out there prematurely and knock off more leaves than you intended to, and that can easily happen. And basically you just halt any further development of those upper bowls. And so that you could compromise your yields by doing that. So I would certainly make sure that the bowls are very mature before you did this, and only do this kind of thing on the acres that you know you're probably going to have to make 2 trips across. In other words, it's lodged over and it's very tall, very thick cotton, very thick foliage, for example. But you also know that you're probably not going to be able to harvest it in that 2-week time frame too. And that will give you some more time to go back in and make a second application. So we've done trials on this, and the success of it is very unpredictable, and it's dependent on conditions that follow that application. So we can't always say it's going to work or bring value to you, because many times what we find is you could have just defoliated normally, and if you paid attention to your nozzle selection and application volume, you'd have been just fine, and you could minimize the need for a second shot or a second application just by paying attention and doing things right the first time. So also consider this: if you go into it with the mindset that you're going to use a 2-shot program, therefore you're using less than ideal rates of certain products, then automatically you're going to have to use 2 shots, where you probably could have, in many cases, gotten away with just 1 application. So that's why we're not sold on the concept necessarily. Now, this illustrates a scenario where it did work. Right? So on the left here are some pictures of where we pre-treated at the bottom versus no preconditioning at the top. And then 7 days after that, after defoliation. So, you know, we pre-treated it here, preconditioned here on the left. On the right, that's 7 days after defoliation. So you can see where we preconditioned, you know, we got more complete defoliation at 7 days after defoliation. So we could go ahead and harvest that. All right. There at the top, still needed time, but we ended up achieving the exact same thing. It just occurred a little bit later. All right. So again, make sure all those bowls are mature before you even attempt to do this, because you could be risking some yield. All right. So somebody brought this up a little earlier or mentioned it in some context. What do we do when we see a frost approaching? And I can foresee a scenario where people wait on this top crop, and we could very easily find ourselves in this scenario this year. So we don't always have the luxury of seeing a frost in advance within 2 or 3 days, but ideally we would have some sort of weather forecast that would give us a 2 or 3 day advance notice, hopefully on a warm sunny day, and I would try to take action then. You don't want to wait until after a frost. Now, a lot of times our first frost is going to be a fairly mild one, but there is no guarantee on that. And we all know how frost can work. You know, it's going to be in pockets, and some are going to be more severe than others. And there's very little way we have of predicting how severe it's going to be other than just looking at temperatures. All right. So if you see one coming in the forecast, I try to take action 2 or 3 days ahead of that. And if you have some unopened bowls that you really want to harvest, the more mature they are, the better. There's nothing that we can do to magically mature a bowl. But if they're on the fence, we might have a chance. All right. So we recommend in that scenario is to defoliate with a standard tank mix using the highest rate of Ethifon or something like Finish or Cotton Quick / First Pick. Which is the latter of which is a little bit better in colder weather. Get good coverage on those bowls with application volume. You need to be using 20 gallons per acre. All right, so that will give you the best chance of popping open some of those bowls in advance of a freeze. If you've already defoliated, and for whatever reason, you just have a few bowls lingering that will not open, but you think that they will, and they're hardened up, and with some pressure, they'll pop open, but they just will not open on their own. Sometimes this works. If you go in with 8, sometimes 12 ounces of a 3-pound material of paraquat, you can add a little Ethifon if you want to. That's more money in a second application, and it may or may not work. And you can only go up to 2 2/3 pints anyway. So if you've already maxed out the label the first time, you can't use Ethifon again. But sometimes an application of paraquat is just enough to pop some of those bowls open by drying out those carpal walls. There is no guarantee. I would never recommend that if you have not already defoliated, simply because that's going to desiccate the plant. You're going to desiccate those leaves and the stalk and the burrs and everything. So you're only going to increase your trash content, and it may not even work. So don't do that unless you have already defoliated. Now, on the label for a lot of these paraquat products, you have to wait 3 days before you can harvest it. But there's no need to wait a week or longer. The longer you wait, that stalk is going to be desiccated at that point and it's going to shatter. So you could end up with bark problems and things like that. All right, so that's all I have. I'm going to try to open it up now for any kind of questions. All right. We got one from David Grant earlier. TDZ needs 24 hours rain-free period. That is correct. Dr. Emerson, if you're still on, Dr. Emerson had a graduate student a couple of years ago who did some really good work with cover crops and a lot of these different defoliants. And if you're on, Dr. Emerson, if you want to unmute yourself and comment on that.
Yeah, we saw some things in the greenhouse that we were not able to see in the field. So in general, if we have not seen defoliants cause problems with cover crop. Is that what you're talking about?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Specifically,
now his question, and I talked to Alan about it because I thought I saw it one time. I talked to Alan. He said the rate of diuron you're putting out is not enough to cause a problem. Yeah. I thought I saw it one time, but he assured me that it's probably not there, and if it is, it's a very uncommon occurrence.
Yeah.
But
Good.
was that his question?
What
was his question?
Well, it just says Genstar and cover crop. In other words, does Genstar cause problems with cover crops? And yeah, I think you answered that.
Yeah.
So, all right. We've got the ability here to, you can unmute yourself or put something in the chat. If anybody's got any questions, have at it. Okay, I'm not seeing anything come through. If you want to unmute yourself and ask something, you feel free to do so now. All right. Well, this is recorded, so we'll once we get the editing done and the captions and all that, we'll post it on the Cotton portal and make it available to anyone who wants to see it. But we do thank everybody for tuning in today, and we'll stay on another minute or two if anybody's got any remaining questions. But thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
All right. Oh, it doesn't look like anybody else will have any questions, so I guess we'll end it.